My name is Adrian Vale, and 5 years ago I learned that the most dangerous enemy a man can have is the one who knows the sound of his laughter, the shape of his dreams, and the cracks in his confidence. I was 54 when it happened, old enough to believe I understood loyalty and young enough to still be blindsided by it. The night everything shattered, I was standing in my own driveway beneath the dull orange glow of a flickering street lamp when my oldest friend, Marcus Dorian, drove his fist into my face while three men I had never seen before held me down against the hood of my truck. I remember the metallic taste of blood, the sharp pop in my ribs, and the sound of my wife's voice somewhere behind them. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging them to stop. She was quiet. I turned my head just enough to see her silhouette near the porch, arms folded, watching as if she were witnessing a storm pass through the neighborhood instead of the dismantling of her husband. I had been married to Elise for 26 years. I had trusted Marcus since we were boys throwing rocks into the same river. That night, I realized both relationships had been rotting long before I smelled decay. When they finally left me on the gravel, half-conscious and humiliated, I understood something with painful clarity. Whatever life I had built in that house was already gone. I dragged myself inside, packed a single duffel bag with shaking hands, and drove until the town lights disappeared in my rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because I didn't know. I only knew that staying would either kill me or turn me into someone I didn't recognize. For nearly 3 years I existed in fragments. I worked under assumed contracts in coastal cities where no one asked about my past. I slept in rented rooms above auto shops and saved every dollar like a man preparing for war. The bruises healed faster than the humiliation, but even that eventually hardened into something usable. Pain, when studied long enough, becomes instruction. I replayed that night 1,000 times, dissecting Marcus's expression, Elise's posture, the timing of everything. The attack had not been spontaneous. It had been choreographed. And I, the fool who believed in handshakes and shared history, had walked onto the stage willingly. During those years away, I trained my body back into strength, not because I craved revenge, but because weakness had become intolerable. I rebuilt my professional contacts quietly, offering mechanical consulting under my full name again once I was certain no one was tracking me. I had owned a specialized heavy equipment restoration company before I left, a business I had spent 3 decades nurturing. When I vanished, I assumed it would collapse without me. What I did not know then was that collapse had been part of someone else's plan. The day I finally decided to return, it was not rage that guided me home. It was a need for truth. I needed to see what had been done in my absence. I needed to understand the full architecture of the betrayal before deciding what to do with it. Driving back into Cedar Hollow felt like stepping into a photograph that had faded at the edges. The houses seemed smaller, the trees thinner, the streets narrower than I remembered. Memory enlarges things, distance corrects them. I parked half a block from what used to be my home and watched. The siding needed repainting. The hedges were uneven. I used to trim them every Sunday morning before church. Through the living room window, I saw Elise packing with a phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something. She looked healthier than she had any right to look. Her hair was shorter now, styled in a way I had never seen during our marriage. She wore jewelry I did not recognize. I had closed our shared accounts the night I left, yet she did not look like a woman struggling to survive abandonment. A small bicycle lay near the garage door, bright yellow with training wheels removed. My youngest daughter, Leela, would be 8 now. I had missed 3 birthdays. The realization tightened my chest in a way no broken rib ever had. My son, Carter, was serving overseas with the military, likely believing the narrative that his father had unraveled mentally and fled responsibility. My middle child, Rowan, would be navigating adolescence without me. I sat in the truck gripping the steering wheel and felt the weight of lost time pressing against my lungs. I had come back prepared for anger. I had not prepared for grief. I did not approach the house that day. Instead, I drove across town to a gated property owned by Theodore Klein, a private collector of industrial vehicles who had once trusted me with his rarest machines. Theodore was a man who valued competence over gossip, which made him useful. When I stepped out of my truck and he recognized me, surprise flickered across his face before settling into something closer to approval. He had heard rumors, he admitted, stories about me losing control, about Marcus defending himself from my instability. He did not believe them. Theodore had seen me work under pressure for decades. He knew the difference between volatility and precision. Inside his cavernous workshop sat a disassembled vintage hauler that someone else had declared beyond repair. I examined it briefly and explained, in technical detail, why it was salvageable. Theodore listened, nodded once, and then offered me access to his facilities. He also mentioned, almost casually, that Marcus had acquired a significant amount of high-grade equipment shortly after my departure, equipment that resembled mine. My jaw tightened, but I kept my tone steady. Theodore was not a sentimental man, he was transactional. If I proved useful, he would remain an ally. If I indulged in theatrics, he would withdraw. I accepted his offer to work from his space temporarily, and understood that I had just secured my first foothold back in town. The financial revelations began a week later in the office of a forensic attorney named Julian Mercer. I had hired him before returning, instructing him to examine any activity tied to my identity during my absence. What he uncovered was meticulous and horrifying. A business entity bearing my name had been restructured 2 months after I disappeared, citing my voluntary resignation due to mental health concerns. My signature appeared on the documents. It was not mine. Equipment transfers were authorized under notarized forms I had never seen. Funds had been rerouted through a shell account established using my Social Security information. Regular deposits flowed in from a company owned by Marcus, then distributed as family maintenance disbursements to Elise. On paper, it appeared I had been financially supporting my household all along while maintaining undisclosed income streams. The design was elegant in its cruelty. If I challenged it, I would look evasive. If I ignored it, I would remain legally entangled. Julian leaned back in his chair and told me this was not opportunistic theft. It was premeditated asset absorption. Someone had not only planned my removal, they had prepared for my silence. Listening to him outline the fraud, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Marcus had not simply wanted my wife. He had wanted my life. Rumors, once I began listening for them, surfaced easily. People spoke more freely when they assumed you already knew the worst. It was during a private conversation with Elise's mother, Marion, that the first crack in the deeper lie appeared. She invited me inside reluctantly, eyes darting as though I carried contagion. After tense exchanges and my presentation of hospital records documenting my injuries from that night, her certainty faltered. She confessed haltingly that Elise had entertained other friendships years before Marcus became constant. A colleague from her old job, a fitness instructor. She had dismissed them as emotional mistakes at the time, believing the marriage would stabilize. She had not told me because she feared dismantling what she called a functional home. The phrase struck me as obscene. Functional for whom? As she spoke, I realized that my marriage had not been a sudden implosion. It had been erosion disguised as weather. Then she hesitated and mentioned something else. The timeline surrounding Leela's conception had overlapped with one of those friendships. I had done the math countless times in motel rooms, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like being dropped through ice. Marion would not meet my eyes when she said Elise refused to discuss paternity and reacted violently to any suggestion of testing. That reaction told me more than any confirmation could have. Securing a court-ordered DNA test required navigating resistance that bordered on hysteria. Elise retained aggressive counsel who painted me as an unstable absentee father seeking to traumatize a child for revenge. The narrative was familiar. It had been rehearsed. During preliminary hearings, I remained calm, presented evidence of identity theft and forged documentation, and allowed Julian to dismantle the opposing arguments systematically. Meanwhile, I continued working from Theodore's facility, rebuilding both income and reputation. Word spread that I was back and that my craftsmanship remained unmatched. Clients returned cautiously at first, then in steady streams. The town, which had once swallowed the story of my supposed breakdown, began reconsidering. Truth does not shout, it accumulates. In the midst of this, my daughter Rowan appeared at the workshop one afternoon, older, sharper, carrying an anxiety no teenager should carry. She told me she had recordings. The night I was beaten, conversations that followed. She had hidden them for years, afraid of fracturing what little stability remained. When I listened to Marcus's voice boasting about ensuring I would never return, and Elise agreeing that my absence simplified everything, the last remnants of doubt evaporated. The conspiracy was not emotional chaos. It was deliberate strategy. The DNA results arrived on an overcast Thursday. I stepped outside to take the call, unable to breathe properly until Julian spoke. Leela was biologically mine. The relief that flooded me was almost painful, followed immediately by fury that anyone had allowed me to question it. Yet even that relief did not erase the damage. A child had been used as leverage in a power struggle she did not understand. Armed with confirmation, financial audits, recorded admissions, and documented fraud, we moved forward with custody proceedings. Elise's health, I learned through disclosures, had been declining due to an aggressive illness she had concealed. Marcus had positioned himself as her indispensable support while simultaneously exploiting her vulnerability. When the court finally rendered its decision months later, primary custody of Leela was granted to me, supervised visitation to Elise, and restitution ordered for misappropriated assets. I stood in the courtroom listening to the ruling and felt no triumph. Only exhaustion and a solemn recognition that rebuilding is quieter than destruction, but far more demanding. Now standing in the workshop that legally belongs to me again, with my children gradually relearning who I am beyond the caricature they were fed, I understand that disappearance was never my end. It was my incubation. Marcus left town when exposure tightened around him. Elise faces the consequences of choices layered over years. I'm not the man who lay bleeding under a street lamp. I am harder now, yes, but also clearer. Betrayal did not end me, it refined me. And whatever comes next, it will be built on foundations no one else controls. The weeks following the custody ruling were not the triumphant march forward I had imagined during my years away. Victory in a courtroom does not automatically translate into peace inside a home. Leela moved into my house with 2 stuffed animals, a box of books, and eyes that studied every room as if measuring whether it was safe to belong there. She did not run into my arms the way she once had when I returned from business trips years ago. She stood at the doorway cautious, as though I might vanish again if she blinked too long. That hesitation pierced deeper than any accusation Elise had ever thrown at me. I realized then that rebuilding a relationship with a child is not accomplished through legal documents, but through consistency so steady it becomes undeniable. I established routines: breakfast together every morning, reading before bed, school drop-offs without fail. I learned the names of her teachers, the subjects she struggled with, the way she chewed her pencil when concentrating. At night, after she fell asleep, I would sit in the hallway outside her room, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, anchoring myself to the simple truth that she was here. Rowan visited often, though she carried anger like a shield. She loved her mother, resented her, pitied her, and felt guilty for all of it. I never forced her to choose sides. Children are not battlegrounds, no matter how adults attempt to turn them into one. Carter returned stateside 2 months later, discharged early due to a shoulder injury that would take time to fully heal. When he walked into my workshop, taller and broader than I remembered, I saw in his posture the discipline the military had carved into him. But beneath that was confusion. He had spent years defending his mother's version of events, confronting anyone who questioned it, and now the evidence contradicted everything he believed. We spoke for hours in the small office overlooking the shop floor. I told him everything without embellishment, my mistakes, my blind spots, my failure to see what was unfolding in my own home. I did not present myself as a martyr. I presented facts. He listened, jaw clenched. Occasionally packing the narrow room, When I showed him the forged documents and the bank transfers, something shifted in his expression from doubt to recognition. "You're not perfect," he said finally, "but you're not a coward." That was all I needed. Respect from a son is not demanded. It is earned slowly, sometimes painfully. He began helping me at the shop during his recovery, learning the technical side of the business with the same intensity he had applied to military drills. In working beside him, I felt a bridge being rebuilt plank by plank. Elise's illness progressed faster than anyone expected. Court-ordered counseling sessions exposed layers of regret she had long suppressed, though regret does not erase consequences. During supervised visitations, I watched her interact with Leela through a pane of reinforced glass, her once vibrant energy diminished. There were moments when I saw genuine remorse flicker across her face, and I had to wrestle with conflicting emotions: anger for what she orchestrated, sorrow for the person she had become, and a strange detachment that surprised me. Loving someone for decades does not evaporate on command. It changes form, sometimes into something unrecognizable but still present. She asked me once quietly if I ever hated her. I told her hatred requires sustained emotional investment, and I no longer had that to give. What I felt was finality. She nodded as if that answer hurt more than an accusation would have. I did not gloat. There was nothing triumphant about watching the mother of my children confront the ruins of her choices. Financially, the restitution payments were slow and heavily structured, but reclaiming the business mattered more than the money itself. I rebranded the company under a new name that carried no trace of the past partnership Marcus had fabricated. Clients who had once hesitated now returned openly, some admitting they had doubted the rumors even when repeating them. Reputation, I learned, is fragile in small towns, but so is deception when exposed. Theodore finalized the sale of his property to me under favorable terms, claiming he preferred to invest in competence rather than sentimentality. Expanding the workshop required long hours, new hires, and constant oversight, but the labor steadied me. Work had always been my language of stability. Carter took on increasing responsibility, showing a natural aptitude for diagnostics and logistics. Rowan helped modernize our online presence, using skills she had developed in school to bring in contracts from neighboring counties. Watching my children contribute to something constructive felt like reclaiming not just assets but identity. Marcus attempted to reemerge indirectly months after his departure by filing a civil complaint alleging defamation tied to the recordings Rowan had made. His argument was desperate and thin. The court dismissed it swiftly once forensic analysis confirmed authenticity. What unsettled me was not the lawsuit itself, but the audacity, the belief that he could still manipulate perception after everything had surfaced. I realized then that some people do not experience shame in the same way others do. They experience inconvenience. His absence from town left a vacuum that gossip filled for a while, but eventually even that subsided. People tire of scandal. They crave stability. I resisted the temptation to monitor his movements or pursue additional retribution. Justice had been served sufficiently through legal channels. Obsession would have tethered me to him longer than necessary, and I refused to grant him that space in my future. Leela's adjustment unfolded gradually. One evening, nearly a year after she moved in, she fell asleep on the couch beside me while we were watching an old nature documentary. Her head rested against my shoulder, trust unguarded. I sat perfectly still, aware of the significance of that small act. Trust from a child who has witnessed fracture is not given lightly. It is extended cautiously, then reinforced through repetition. I began attending every school event, volunteering for field trips, showing up in ways I once assumed were implied by fatherhood rather than demonstrated. Rowan's anger softened into something more nuanced. She confronted her mother during therapy sessions with questions that demanded accountability. I did not interfere. Healing cannot be micromanaged. Carter, meanwhile, found renewed direction through mentorship programs for young veterans, channeling his experience into guidance for others transitioning back to civilian life. Watching him lead with integrity reassured me that cycles of manipulation could be broken. There were nights when exhaustion pressed heavily on me, when memories of that driveway resurfaced with unsettling clarity, the crack of bone, the silence from the porch. In those moments, I reminded myself that survival had not been the ultimate goal. Transformation had been. I had left town fractured and returned deliberate. I had been naive in my loyalty once, equating longevity with trustworthiness. Now I understood that character is measured not by shared history but by consistent action. If there was a lesson in all of this, it was not that betrayal is inevitable, but that discernment is essential. I no longer accepted vague reassurances or ignored inconsistencies to preserve comfort. Peace built on denial is temporary at best. 2 years after my return, the workshop expanded into a second building, doubling capacity. Carter officially became a partner, though legally I structured it with safeguards that prevented unilateral control from ever shifting without oversight. Transparency was woven into every contract. Rowan began pursuing a degree in business management with the intention of strengthening the administrative side of our operation. Leela, now older and more confident, spent afternoons doing homework at the front desk, greeting customers with a seriousness that made them smile. Our house, once a monument to deception, felt lighter. Not perfect, no home ever is, but honest. The walls no longer held secrets that suffocated the air. Elise's health eventually stabilized enough for limited unsupervised visits, contingent on continued compliance with therapy and restitution agreements. Our interactions remained civil and brief. We discussed logistics, education plans, medical updates, never the past. That chapter had been litigated thoroughly. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the woman I married decades ago in the way she laughed at one of Leela's jokes or corrected Rowan's grammar instinctively. It reminded me that people are not entirely villain or entirely victim. They are choices layered over potential. Elise's choices had dismantled our marriage, but they did not erase her motherhood entirely. Allowing the children space to define their own relationships with her required restraint on my part, but restraint is a form of strength rarely celebrated. When I reflect now on the man who drove away that night with a duffel bag and shattered ribs, I recognize how close he came to disappearing permanently, not physically, but internally. Exile can either hollow you out or refine you. I chose refinement, though it demanded confronting truths I would have preferred to avoid. Betrayal stripped illusions from my life, but it also forced me to construct something sturdier in their absence. My friendships are fewer but tested. My business is leaner but protected. My relationship with my children is grounded in honesty rather than assumption. I no longer measure success by appearances or community approval. I measure it by alignment, between word and action, between promise and follow-through. If there is a finality to this story, it is not in the courtroom decision or Marcus's departure or even the confirmation of Leela's paternity. It lies in the quiet evenings when my children are home, the workshop lights dimmed, the accounts balanced, and there is no performance required. I once believed loyalty was proven through endurance, staying no matter what. Now I understand that sometimes loyalty to yourself requires leaving, rebuilding, and returning stronger. I did not come back for revenge. I came back for truth. In securing it, I regained far more than property or reputation. I reclaimed authorship over my own life.